for me in the beginning, but just wanted to touch on a little bit about myself as well, just as some other introduction pieces. Is that, yeah, I serve as the IT communications facilitator for Hudson River Presbytery, also known as a tech wizard by some people. I make it happen. I originally came onto the Presbytery staff during 2020 as an independent consultant who worked with churches, and our Presbytery had given out grants to congregations, and I was sort of there helping them pick out what they needed and being on call as a resource. And that transitioned into a staff person position as we realized that this is going to be even a valuable resource for our Presbytery. So that is how I transitioned into helping to resource the many congregations in our Presbytery, as well as I know I've worked with some folks in Jersey who I'm friends with, and so I feel like I've spread out the tentacles a little more in that regards as well. But in addition to being a Presbytery staff person, I also currently serve as a solo pastor at a what I'll call it a smaller congregation. We have about 100 or so members, with about mid 40s for worship. The First Presbyterian Church of Mahopac here in Hudson River Presbytery. And I just wanted to give you a little glimpse into our live streaming journey, because when I first arrived there in 2019, we started off with a camera. It was someone's, donated cell phone, had a camera, and, it really only captured this kind of wide shot that you see right now. Picture quality wasn't so great. Sound was actually not as bad as you might think, but that was really it. This sort of static front-facing view. Then the pandemic hit, and we shifted how we did things. I'm sure if you're, you can talk to your pastor or other church leaders. I'm sure that they created home studios in their home, and that's what we ended up doing at First Presbyterian Church of Mahopac. Shifted to doing worship strictly at home in a virtual setting. But thanks to the help of Presbytery grant money and some fundraising on our own end, we transitioned to a more future-proof live streaming setup now that has produced this kind of end product that you'll currently find if you were to visit our church website today, or our YouTube channel or Facebook page. So that's sort of the progression of our live streaming journey at the church I currently serve. And perhaps it would be interesting for you all to chronicle where you started from, even if it was from nothing, but to chronicle where it is you started and where it is perhaps you are now. Because I think we would even be amazed at those steps we might think are small and how they've impacted the kind of experience we're looking to create. I have some opening thoughts for us when it comes to church and technology. I know, talking with Gene, and perhaps Gene can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you already had a workshop or a seminar or something like that about, why this is important. Is that yeah, okay, so this is more, I'm going to talk a little more about the technical side of it today, and I have some of these opening thoughts that I want you to consider. The first is this: that just because something's free, it doesn't make it better. And what I mean by that is, just because you have access to a free platform, let's say like Facebook, that might not create the best end user experience for your volunteers who are trying to set it up every day. And having worked with Facebook and YouTube Live, I can say that even as someone who's used to doing this kind of tech at this point, they're not always the most user-friendly things. Free tools can be great, but again, that doesn't always mean they're better in terms of what you're trying to get to. Now, there's some exceptions to that rule, like everything, and we'll talk about that. But that's the first sort of thought I want us to keep in mind. The second one is that cheap doesn't always mean better. When I mean cheap, I'm talking about you go out and buy a $200-$300 laptop. That $203 laptop could get you some good mileage, but the reality is that laptop and what you hope to use it for probably won't extend past the life you're hoping it's going to have. So in many ways, even though it may not see upfront, even though it might seem a little more upfront, it really is a kind of investment that you're putting into it. There are some really good inexpensive solutions, and we're going to take a look at that as well. So that's just the other thought I want us to keep in mind. And as I said, these are more guidelines than than rules. The other opening thought is, I'm going to throw out a lot of stuff today, and you'll have access to it. But take and use what you want. We're going to talk about setups later on in this presentation, some sample setups, and they may look like intimidating charts, but you can really, you could sort of pick and choose parts of it you want to use. You don't have to feel like you have to follow these things exactly. And sort of touching on what I said before, I think it's important to budget for the future. Again, the upfront costs may seem a little higher, but if what you're looking for is going to last longer because you spent a little more on higher quality equipment, or equipment that's going to leave you room to expand and grow later on, that'll be really a future cost saving as well, even though it seems higher up front, just because you're not having to keep buying new stuff to replace all the little things you bought along the way. Talking about, again, the kind of free is not always better. Look at also investing in tools that make live streaming easier for your volunteers, whoever that's going to be. Because as we're also going to talk a little bit about volunteers, I don't want the people who are volunteering to run the live stream at my church, tearing their their hair out every week because they can't figure out what it is they need to do. And the last thing is, in terms of budgeting and looking at the future, this really is an extension of your physical building, your physical space. And to think that the people who may be worshiping with you online, or the future people who may join you online, are not somehow connected to your community of faith, I think is a little bit on the short-sighted side of it. So I would really challenge us to think about this as that kind of extension of what we do as well. Just lastly here, just wanted to touch on, again, we're going to throw out some different possibilities, but focus on doing what's possible. We can shoot high, but if we can't actually carry that out in our current context, then that's also frustrating. And let's just focus on doing the best setup that you can in your current church or community that's going to meet your live streaming needs. Because fancier doesn't always mean it's going to be just because if you set your stream up or your online worshiping experience to be fancy, that doesn't always mean you're going to get more viewers. I think that's where that conversation about authenticity steps into the picture. Now, the first part about equipment setup that I'm going to talk about is internet. Not the most glamorous thing in the world, but internet is important to how we provide that online worship experience. And it's, of course, a vital part of the setup to how you live stream. When you look at your internet at your church, and you could do this at home if you're live streaming, but when it comes to internet, you're going to want to focus more on the upload speed more than the download speed. Download means I could download 10 I don't download movies, but I could download 10 Disney movies really fast if I had a high download speed. But that if I have a low upload speed, that's not going to help the quality or the picture image or anything else I'm trying to share, if I don't have a good upload speed. And when you're looking at your internet speed currently at your church, you're going to want to aim at minimum. I would say it should even be more like 1520, but at minimum, you should have at least a 10 megabit internet upload speed. And that will allow for at least a 720p broadcast. Used to be considered high definition, still is in some circles, but with how much better screens are getting, you may want to shoot a little higher than that as well. When it comes to internet as well for live streaming, I am an evangelist for Ethernet. Now, Ethernet is hard, and I know some older church buildings that were not designed for internet, and so I understand that Ethernet, or that hardwired connection from your internet, where your internet comes in to where your computer is, that's not always possible. But I think if you're able to sort of rig away for an Ethernet cable to get from your router to your computer, that is going to be your best bet, especially in some of these older church buildings that have really thick stone walls or walls that are reinforced with rebar. And it just doesn't really allow you to rely on Wi-Fi access the same way that you would with Ethernet. If you're in a situation where you find that your church internet isn't fast enough to meet what it is you're looking for, I highly recommend talking to your internet provider. Because when I've worked with a lot of churches here in Hudson River Presbytery, some of them are still using plans that they haven't looked at updating or seeing what's new out there, and they're still paying the same price for what would be almost a newer plan that offers more speed. So it's worthwhile to look at what your internet provider is currently offering. Perhaps they may offer you a better deal. And I would say to Patricia's question in the chat about wireless not being good. Wireless, so I should say this. Wireless can work. You can make wireless work. And I think it can be done in a way that's really well. My experience with Wi-Fi has not always been the most positive in terms of relying on it for stability of a live stream. I've had situations where I did try using Wi-Fi, and sometimes things happen. I don't know, the stars are aligned in certain ways, and it makes it that our live stream will drop out. Now, I'm not saying that happens every time I use Wi-Fi, but if you're looking for a really solid, I guess if you're really trying to create less points of failure along the way, Ethernet is always going to be the safer bet. But if you find that Wi-Fi is what's working for you right now, that's fine. I think if you have something that works, that's good. But for me, I'm always an advocate of providing that hard line internet connection to whatever device you're streaming from. I just want to show you a little bit of a sample of this, because perhaps you never even tried doing a speed test before. But if you were to even just go to google.com, and you type in speed test, you see that Google already provides you this nice little pop-up for running a speed test. And if you just clicked run speed, you can see that it'll tell you first what your download speed is, and then it'll show you what your upload speed is. And again, I think you're aiming for something in that minimally between 10 to 15. You can sort of ignore the crazy high-speed internet I have at my house, but you're hopefully aiming for something between 10 to 15 megabits for your internet speed. And again, if you're not sure what that is, you can just go to Google and search for your internet speed. it's a really nifty little tool if you're trying to troubleshoot perhaps even some of the ways in which you're having trouble with the quality of your live stream. The next thing I want to talk about, I believe that's the only question I saw in the chat so far about internet. So I'm going to keep going on to streaming services. When it comes to streaming services, you have some free options. You have free options found in Facebook and YouTube, and if you are currently on Zoom with your church, you know that you can also stream to Facebook or YouTube as well. But you can also stream directly to Facebook or YouTube, and those are sort of cool tools that they offer because it offers you access to your fan base there who like your page on Facebook. And perhaps even others. I always encourage my folks to share the worship service on Sunday because it's never been easier to invite someone to church. So, those are great platforms if you're looking for a free solution. But if you're streaming directly to Facebook or YouTube, you should know that you can only stream to one service at a time unless you're using some kind of paid, or there's some unpaid services as well that let you stream to multiple platforms at one time. And this sort of goes back to that first rule I said, which is that free is not always better because it can be tricky to set up or start or schedule live streams on Facebook or YouTube. Facebook especially, I think Martin, who's from my Presbytery, could attest to that because I gave him some really nice detailed written out instructions on how to set up a stream for Facebook, and the next week Facebook decided, hey, let's change how we format everything on that live stream page. And so that's sort of the issue you're going to run into with some of these free services or options if you stream directly to them, because they will update and perhaps change the way they look. So it's always sort of being on top of that. Yeah, I see. Yeah, I see that Mark is also sharing the same feelings for that. The other thing that I've experienced in terms of using only a free service such as Facebook or YouTube, streaming directly to them from your computer, is that the audio may not always be what you desire. I've run into the experience where, and I think this question comes more from music directors than from the pastor, but when they go back and look at video that was strictly streamed to Facebook or YouTube, the quality does not always seem to be the way it is. Which is where some of the benefits of using a free studio software, which we'll come to in a little bit, or a streaming service sort of help offset the poor audio quality that comes from only using a place like Facebook or YouTube. I would say that for YouTube and Facebook, well, for Facebook, I should say this, is that if you're looking to stream with Facebook on a mobile device, you can do that from your phone. And there's no kind of limitations on that. But if you are looking at streaming to YouTube, you can do it from a computer and there's no kind of restrictions on that. But if you are streaming to YouTube, you can't do that from a purely mobile device unless you've hit at least 1,000 subscribers. I think is still what the cap is on that for YouTube mobile. You could do it from a computer, just not from your phone. And to answer the question about audio, the audio that I'm talking about in terms of the quality of the audio for Facebook and YouTube is not so much the mics. It's about how Facebook and YouTube process that audio. Facebook and YouTube sort of compress the audio in a way that even if you're using really great sounding mics, it's, things like music are not going to sound really sharp the way you want them to, which is where using an outside studio software or streaming service comes into play. That was a lot. We could circle back to this again in the in question time, so don't have no fear. Um, this is where I wanted to talk about briefly free service or more paid services that allow you to stream and also have a built-in studio to them. And these are, I feel like, are worthwhile kind of investments. I named two, just sort of. There's other options out there though. These streaming services often allow you to stream to more than one platform at a time. So you know how I said if you're streaming directly to Facebook or YouTube before, you could only do it one at a time. Well, a lot of these services often allow you to broadcast to multiple platforms at one time, which is great, to be able to broadcast on Facebook and YouTube and to even some other platforms as well. That it really just expands your reach. Some of them also provide a web-based studio, which I'm going to show you an example of real quickly here. So, for example, this paid service is what I use for my church. It's called Restream. It's about $199 a year, and they don't pay me to. This is not a sponsorship. I'm just saying this is what's worked for our church. But this is a streaming service called Restream that we use, and you can see that it has a bunch of built-in tools and graphics. I can call myself First Presbyterian, whatever, and if I have a speaker, I can sort of throw up a nifty little caption for them, or like if there's a scripture reading, I can put up the scripture reading. And this is a pretty intuitive studio that's already built in and gives you access to some of the benefits of using a separate streaming studio as well, but it's all wrapped into one package. So it's something that I would really consider looking at investing in terms of accessibility and ease of use when it comes to helping set up your volunteers for success as well. Some of the cool things about some of these paid services as well is that they allow you to have a combined chat from Facebook and YouTube, which in my current context, for example, is nice because that means I get to see, if there's prayer requests that come in, I can see it coming in from all different areas. From Facebook and YouTube, and I don't have to have like 5 windows open on my phone while I'm looking out there and thinking, oh, are people thinking I'm just texting during? No, but it's nice to be able to have that combined chat feature in which you can see everything that's coming in. The only downside to really paid streaming services, besides the cost, I know for some people that may be a thing, but the only other downside for streaming services, if you're not using another free tool that I'll show you that I think is good, is that some features may require upgrades. And in most cases, you don't really have to worry about those unless you are really looking for certain things. But for the most part, you could just get away with the base subscription. Someone asked in the chat to me, if this replaces Zoom or if it's supplemental. And what I would say is these streaming services, for example, don't you can work them into your current workflow with Zoom and things like that. If you wanted to, for example, use Zoom as the way in which you communicate and then be the primary space for your worship, and then send that stream to Facebook or YouTube or something like that's more than fine as well. It all sort of depends on what you are really looking for. And then the other question I saw that came in is about Oh yeah, about everyone's other favorite topic, licensing. It, so if you pay for a streaming service like this, you're still going to need something like a one license for music, for example, and to just have that license indicated in your stream description or something like that. Um, so paying for a streaming service does not mean, unfortunately, that you can just sort of share all the music you want. You'll still want that music for music. We'll come back to streaming services later on during the questions time. Wanted to just move on tech-wise to software. Really great free software service that you can use if you're looking for a broadcasting software. I use OBS, which is Open Broadcaster Software, and you see that the link is pink. So when you get this PowerPoint, you'll be able to just click it and it'll open it to the page for you. So trying to make that as easy as possible. What's nice about it, besides it being free, is that because this is an open source software and is meant to be used by a lot of different people, there's a lot of great guides out there. So if you're not sure how to do something, or you perhaps have an idea for something you want to do with your stream, there's a lot of great guides and even some really great YouTube tutorials that will walk you through step by step in setting things up. So it's not one of those softwares that there's not a lot of resources for, but there's a very active community around this software that will help you really get to where you want to go to. You can create things like scenes or pre-rolls or things that show before your live stream. Right now, how I'm talking to you on Zoom, showing myself and the slides, and I have a little background picture. I'm using OBS right now in terms of showing you some of our live streaming stuff. What I really like about using software studios is that it really, such as OBS, is that it will allow for almost an unlimited allows for unlimited possibilities, really, in terms of creativity and how you want to set up your live stream. Or I don't usually like thinking about it this way, but branding or marketing your church as well. But that is almost a way to think about it, is that if you can think about it, you can almost make it happen. You can make so much happen in this in this space. Now, for those who do use Zoom and who like using Zoom still as well in their worship, the cool thing about something like OBS is that it allows you to create a virtual camera. So you can bring in all your high production, or you can bring in whatever production elements you want, and to use that camera for your Zoom call. So that's, right now I'm not sharing my screen on Zoom, for example. I'm sharing my virtual camera with how I wanted things laid out. And these are all things you can find in the guide if you decide to pursue that avenue. I'm putting it out there for you if you'd like to learn a little more about it. It will require some practice, some study, but I really do think that this is a free tool. In the case that I said free is not always better, but in this case, it really is a free tool that is worth it if you put effort into it, just in terms of the unlimited possibilities of things you can do. So, for example, an example of OBS is, when I preach at my church, I sometimes have elements I like to throw up on the screen or whatnot. That's also in the church, but I can also put it up specifically on the live stream. And you can sort of create these different formats for how you want to lay things out and for different scenarios. So just some of the cool things that you can do with OBS. Okay, so I want to say that I appreciate you sticking with me through that first part, in which we talked a lot about internet things and all the sort of trickiness that goes along with that. But now we're going to start looking more into the actual hardware side of it, beginning with audio. Disclaimer, though, is that I'm not an audio expert. I'm great when it comes to the technology, like computers, cameras, setting up all the other parts. But when it comes to knowing what specific audio equipment you need, I have a good idea of what you might need, but I'm not an expert when it comes to audio. So I don't mean that as in any way of a diss to myself or a discount to myself, but I just want to put that out there. But I do know this after working in my own church and working with other churches. If it's not mic'd, it will not be heard. Unless you're using something like Zoom and you're allowing, you're just using one mic to sort of capture all the ambient noise. If it's not mic'd, it won't be heard. There are a number of churches' live streams that I've gone to visit where they have some, what I assume to be really stellar special music, where they have it off to the side somewhere or whatnot, but there's no mic. So the people in the sanctuary can hear it, but everyone else who's watching can't hear it. Same thing. I mean, so that is something to be really mindful of in terms of audio and what you're looking at in terms of your audio setup. Some other things to consider is this: does your worship leader or your pastor walk around? Because, for example, there's churches that I've also seen on their live stream where their pastor, you can hear them at the pulpit because they have a mic. As soon as they walk to the communion table, you can't hear anything they're saying because they're not mic'd. So perhaps that means investing in a decent and inexpensive lapel mic for them so that they are able to be heard both at the pulpit, but also perhaps when they're doing the communion part of the service or when they do the children's portion. Something to consider. Same thing that I said about special music is if you're going to have special music, things like that, perhaps consider looking at investing in a microphone that would allow that to be heard. Again, you can get some pretty good mics that don't cost that much money. The other big one is, of course, is how are you going to mic other parts of worship, such as, when your choir sings, if it's singing right now, or down the line, perhaps so, and things like the organ as well. Some important things to consider. Frederick, who just direct messaged me, said his solution that he has some really great audio to it, and that's actually part of a setup I'm going to talk about later on, so you all don't feel like you have to miss out on it. Some additional things I think when we're talking about audio is that I do recommend investing or looking at a lapel mic for your worship leader or your pastor. Just make sure that it's FCC compliant. You can do a quick cursory search for what that means. It has to do with the hertz or the frequency that it works at. But most of the newer ones now that you can buy fall within that range of what's appropriate. But something to look at and something to consider. Some other things if you're looking for, if you're going a more computer-based route that works with your sound system that you have currently, perhaps consider looking at some boundary or shotgun microphones, because those can be good tools in terms of capturing a wide array of audio for you. Also, then just consider perhaps having a few cheap mic stands or stand mics that you can put on a stand for special music or events, because you never know when those might come in handy. Just some audio equipment-wise things you might want to consider. In the PowerPoint as well that I have here, I do have some other things for us to consider about audio, which is that later on we're going to talk about some sample setups, and I make some assumptions about what those look like. But the final price of those really depends on what equipment you already have. So let's say you already have in your church a soundboard, or you have a mixer that you bought after the 60s. I say that jokingly because I've encountered sound systems in churches where they really had to start looking at something new because what they had was just so old it could not interface with some of the newer stuff we're talking about. But if you have a soundboard though that still has like the jacks in it, that you can plug something into that looks like your headphone jack but a bigger cord, or it has those what we call XLR mics, you can still use that soundboard, that sound system, without investing in something new if you wanted to look at the case of buying a USB interface, audio interface device that allows you to still keep your current mixer, your current soundboard, or your audio. You can buy one of these devices that you can then take the sound from that, convert it into something your computer can use, and that already there is a cost-saving measure. The only downside to something like a USB audio interface is that while it allows you to save on money in terms of buying new equipment, it only allows for one-way audio. So that means what your soundboard takes in can be sent to the computer, but if you're expecting like a Zoom person to be able to say something back through it, it doesn't work that way. It's only a one-way audio feed. So that's just something to consider. And I learned this the hard way before we upgraded our sound system, but it may require just a little bit of tweaking to remove any static noise. And I don't want to say how much time I did that because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist in that route. So, but for you all, perhaps, it won't take you as long, but it may require a little bit of tweaking. To answer just quickly the question I see in the chat about condenser mics. Yeah, condenser mics are perfect and they would work great. The condenser mics work great for speakers, for music if you have them mic'd the right way. If you have questions about audio, I think one of the best places I could recommend that you go start looking at is your local music store, perhaps. I'm really good friends with a local music shop here in town he does audio stuff, and I remember walking in and being like, hey, I have some questions about my sound system, could you help answer some of those for me? And he was more than happy to. So that might be a good local place to start if you have questions. The other thing I want to touch on, the alternative to a USB audio interface, is a USB soundboard or mixer, which is what we ended up upgrading to at the church I'm at now. What's really nice about the USB soundboard mixer is that instead of relying on sort of an intermediary device to bridge the audio gap, you can take the audio right from the board into your computer, and it allows for two-way communication in terms of audio. So you can take what you're hearing from the sanctuary mics and put it into your live stream, and you can also take any computer audio and put that back out into your church's sound system. So if you're really looking to create in certain situations a hybrid worship scenario, perhaps you have someone on Zoom who you want to do the reading, this might be more of the option you want to look at in terms of focusing on a place where you could upgrade some of your equipment. For us, for example, I guess we could be a use case for that. I still have virtual lectors who sometimes join in by Zoom or who record themselves and send in their readings for the week. And I'm able to show those, and the sound is able to play both on the live stream and on and in the sanctuary, so people can hear them and see them. So this is I think a great solution, especially in terms of how much in price they've come down over time. And as I said, this might be a good option if you're looking for some more flexibility, if you're still a heavy Zoom user in your church. And my personal opinion is that I found that I had a cleaner audio overall compared to using an interface device. But that, for me, that was a personal preference. Some tips when it comes to audio is, I think, having patience. Understanding that any troubleshooting may take a while depending on how many people are helping you troubleshoot that audio, which is okay. Like I said, if that means bringing in a friend or someone who knows more about audio, bring them in to help. The more the merrier. Sometimes that means investing in new equipment, which is okay. And again, price-wise, I think a lot of these things have come down over time. And if you're looking at investing in microphones, perhaps looking at something that's more broad is not always a bad thing, as it allows for you to capture some ambient noise as well as, some of those other things we talked about in terms of music and other parts of worship. Someone did ask a question in the chat about latency. I have not noticed any latency issues using a USB soundboard. And for folks on the call, latency is like the delay, I guess I should say, between the audio and video. So if there's high latency, I could be speaking and my mouth does not line up with what I'm saying, because it might. But in this case, the USB soundboard that I've experienced has not had any latency issues. I'm not going to go over these, but this is more for your benefit when you have access to this slideshow later on. Is I do have some examples of different microphones. I will correct that one typo I just noticed. But some examples of boundary microphones, shotgun microphones, and also some examples so that you can hear them as well, what they sound like. I find that's always helpful to be able to hear what those are like. So you'll be able to access those as well. So that covers audio in terms of helping you think about what you might need for your church. My wheelhouse now, and turning into my wheelhouse, talking about computers. First, our laptops. Look, I our church, we did, and many churches, I think, have used a laptop. And the pro is that they can be less expensive than their desktop counterparts in terms of setup. And they're also portable. For us, that's been nice when we've done some outdoor worship. I've just been able to carry the laptop computer with me outside to where we're doing worship and to be able to set that up. Some of the cons, though, when it comes to the laptops, when you're thinking about them, is that they're not always future-proof. There's some, depending on what laptop you buy, you may be able to expand some of the features of it, like how much you can store on it, or like the speed, the memory, RAM. But there's not always clear upgrade paths, which means that when that computer has hit its lifespan, that's really it, and you got to start looking at buying a new laptop. And the cheaper you go in terms of buying laptops, that really shortens their lifespan. Or I think the less expensive you go, the more that impacts how long that computer's going to last for. I think for me personally, when you're thinking about buying a laptop, I think you need to start looking at the 500 and up range if you're looking for something that's going to last longer than 3 years. I'm not saying, I throw that number out there, but, working with churches here in the Presbytery, I know places that have bought lower end laptops that were like, $200, $300, and it worked, but like they always kept running into issues, and some of them just died eventually. And so I really think if you're going to start looking at an intro level, around $500 is a good place to start. Depending on your budget, you can look for laptops with dedicated graphics cards, and you could just include that in a Google search if you're looking for it. And I'll also have a list of some examples, because that will help with your live streaming experience as well. Just a simple stat to throw out there, I think you also should look at laptops that have at least 16 gigabytes of RAM, perhaps even more depending on what you're doing, but 16 I think is a good number for getting as much life out of the device as you can. And storage, how much you can hold, depends on how you intend to use the laptop. Because if you plan on using it also for video editing, you're going to want more storage, because video eats up a lot of space on your computer. In an ideal world, I think most of us would look at investing in desktop computers, mostly because I am a fan of the I'm more of a fan of the upgradable or more future-proof access to I'm not sure what I meant in that sentence, but you have access to more powerful hardware down the line in terms of what you're looking for. You can swap out certain components as they age over time, replace them with newer things, and you're not always buying a new computer every few years. The con, of course, is that it is more expensive up front, I think, compared to looking at a laptop. Requires perhaps a little more in terms of peripherals, because you're going to need like a monitor for that laptop. And maybe in some cases, just being able to set it up and upgrade it down the line, you may need a little more technical knowledge. The question someone asked about laptops. There's a couple questions about. Someone asked about gamer laptops and if it's good to look at gamer laptops. Yeah, I mean, I think depending on what you're really looking to use the laptop for, like if you have really ambitious plans down the line for like expanding your tech setup, like can't go wrong with a gamer laptop, because it's going to have a dedicated graphics card. It's going to have all the power you could ever possibly need. And if you're looking at doing some video editing as well, it's going to have that capability as well, especially. And if you're looking for portability, then that works as well as a solution. All-in-one computers, someone also asked a question about. So all-in-one computers are going to be like the monitor and the computer are sort of all encased in one thing. It depends on what kind of all-in-one laptop or all-in-one computer you're looking at, because some of them, again, don't have clear upgrade paths the same way that a dedicated desktop would. So that would just be something to keep in mind. Buying tip-wise, I think you could start out getting a pretty good desktop to meet your need between $700-800, not including anything else like a monitor or something like that. You could look for ones that have graphics cards from AMD, or NVIDIA is another popular company. Again, starting out with 16 gigabytes of RAM is good as well, and you have the same kind of considerations when it comes to storage. Something I will touch on also when it comes to like things like monitors and whatnot is ask folks in your church what they have lying around. Before we're currently looking at, for example, upgrading to a projector in our church. But right now we have a large screen TV because someone was getting a new one, and they were like, do you want to use this in your church? And I said, sure. But even perhaps when it comes to smaller monitors and stuff like that, before you buy, ask around, because if you can repurpose some of the technology that people might have lying around their house, in some of these instances, it's worth asking. Some additional tips, I think, depending on what you're looking at, is I think after 5 years, it's good to start assessing where you're at with your current computer and whether or not you're going to need to upgrade parts of it if you want the desktop route or buying a new one. I'm not saying at 5 years you're going to need to buy a new computer, but I think you should start preparing to buy one in terms of how you budget and things like that. Especially as technology continues to improve. Part of that process, though, and how you can extend the life of your computer is, friends, please delete clutter from your computer. Don't leave video files on it that are, because someone accidentally hit record and it was recording and just saved a large file on it. clean out the internet browser cache, or do things that will help preserve the life of your computer, that help extend it and give it longer life. This also includes, if you are a laptop and even a desktop user, this includes not leaving like 20 tabs open on your internet browser, because that will eat up a lot of a lot of the speed on your computer, and it's just not a good situation. Something you might not consider, though, is depending on where you are planning to keep your laptop or your desktop, make sure it has ventilation. Because a hot computer is not a happy computer. So, if you have a laptop, just make sure that it sort of has the ventilation it needs. And if you have a desktop and you're going to build like a streaming booth for it, like, don't put it directly on the floor, like all the way in the back where it's not going to get good airflow. Like, think about how you're going to set that up a little bit, prop it up a little bit so it's not directly on the floor, and make sure it has good airflow. Someone asked, Judy asked a very good question about supply chain shortages. Yeah, it is still a wild world out there in terms of locating hardware. I think the prices now may still be a little higher, but I did a cursory look before this workshop, and you could still buy some pretty good hardware. You could still buy some pretty good hardware at a slightly higher than like before times cost. But it's you could do a lot of looking around and find stuff that would still be within your price range and be good. Gonna move on to talking about videos here. And there's lots of different things to talk about. I'm going to talk about some mobile solutions here in a second as well, just in case you're, perhaps a computer is not your only option. But there's so many different options when we think about cameras or video for live streams. You have video cameras. I'm going to highlight what Scott said as well. Keeping your computer up to date. Yeah, that is always important as well. But when we're talking about video, you have, your sort of traditional video camera. You have some newer things that have come out, like pan, tilt, and zoom cameras. I'm going to call them PTZ. And then I'm going to say mobile cameras, and I'll expand on that in a little bit here. And each camera, I think has its pros and cons, and will fit your need depending on what you're really looking for. Starting out with the good old trusted video camera, just some things to be aware of is that if you're using a video camera, you're going to need what's called a video capture card. And in the PowerPoint, I linked to an example of one that you can buy. You'll also want to look for a camera that has clean HDMI out. So that means when you look at the video, people are not also seeing how much battery do you have left? What day, what time is it? When it's clean HDMI, that means you're just getting the video portion of it. And that is a setting you'll have to go in to tweak, but you'll want to look for a camera that has clean HDMI out. And when you click on that link in the PowerPoint, it'll show you some examples. But you can also find it by searching online as well. I would also recommend looking at a quality tripod when it comes to video cameras. I know that you can find the ones that's just sort of the ball head pivot, but if you could find one that even just has an arm on it for someone to control smoothly, that makes a world of difference. The other option I'm going to talk about is sort of what I've categorized as being more of a mobile camera. In this case, Mevo, which used to be its own company, but is now owned by Logitech. These are some really nifty little cameras, and that fall outside of the scope of some of what we talked about. Is that you do need an app to run these cameras, but you can run it from something like an iPad, which I would recommend. So in this case, you wouldn't even need a computer. You just need something like an iPad to run your camera. You can also now link these cameras together from the app, so you can have like multiple different perspectives that you're just sort of tapping to and streaming to. You know, if you wanted like a sanctuary view, a pulpit view, you can easily do that with these Mevo cameras. Pretty really nifty tools. And the built-in microphones are not that bad sounding, quite honestly. If you're just talking about the ambient noise that they capture. At the end, towards the end of this slideshow, you can click to see through an example of a church in Hudson River Presbytery that uses a Mevo camera. And these also offer some really nice things in terms of flexibility. You know, you can mount them on a tripod. You can get some little wall mounts for them if you wanted to stick them up there. Just really nifty little cameras that I you know, if buying a computer is not in your wheelhouse or anything like that, you know, I think it's worth looking at these cameras. If you're willing to invest in something like an iPad and these camera setups, I think it's a really nice way to look at things. The last thing camera I wanted to look at was a PTZ, because that's currently what I use at my church as well. Is that generally they're a little more expensive. Generally, they are more expensive than the other types of cameras we looked at. What I like about them, though, is that, yeah, like in a one camera setup, I can create different presets. So I can have the camera hone in on the pulpit, have the camera pan out to a view of the sanctuary or to the choir. So in one camera, I'm able to get all these different kind of views in a way that meets our needs without having to invest in more than one camera. You can incorporate more than one, but then you're talking, you know, really high budgets. And in most cases, I don't think you need more than one, but it's something you can always look at as an upgrade path. A lot of these PTZ cameras you can also control with a piece of software that it comes with. It offers software controls. A lot of them will also come with something that looks like your TV remote to control. Or you can buy separately like a joystick controller and sort of move it around as well if you like. So there's different options for controlling them. Just talking a little bit about PTZ cameras as well, there's different types that you would want to look at then as well. USB is probably the simplest. And then there's other ones that get into a little higher quality, but they require additional pieces of equipment. There was a really great question about cost for cameras, and I could just touch on those really briefly here for a second. Which is that for video cameras, camcorders, depending on what you have, you know, if you have someone who has one that they're willing to donate, then that, you know, that's free. But I think, you know, if you're looking for a clean HDMI out video camera, like a camcorder, I believe you can buy something that's decent for, I think you can buy some still that are under $200, but depending on what you're looking for, you could spend, you know, $200, $300, $400 on one as well, which also depends on the size of your sanctuary. Because if you have a really big sanctuary, and depending on where you're going to put that camera, you may need one with more zoom, which may cost more money. But you could buy a handheld camera for what I consider a reasonable price. The Mevo camera that we talked about, the mobile solution, those usually come in around, I want to say $330, $340 dollars for a camera, and then you pair that with the iPad, and the iPad and the program that it comes with is nice because it also has a studio sort of built in. So that's probably what you're looking at around for a mobile solution like the Mevo. Of course, if you're using your phone, that also you could use as a mobile type solution. And then lastly, for a PTZ camera, you're probably looking at a good starting point around, I want to say, 600 or more is what you're looking at in terms of a starting price for that. So I hope that helps. And that'll also be covered in the handout that'll be going out as well. But just in terms of this recording, thank you for bringing up that question. And lastly, Scott asked a question about is GoPro an example of a Mevo? So I should say that Mevo is a brand that of camera you can buy from Logitech, but I'm not as familiar, I admit, with GoPro as a streaming camera. I want to say I feel like I've read articles that have said shown how you can use a GoPro for that, but it would require me to look up a little more on my end. I'm going to skip over optional things because you'll have access to those and they're optional. Because I want to leave enough time for you to ask questions. Okay, so I'm just going to run through some sample setups really quickly here. And in these sample setups, I make some assumptions. I make assumptions that you're buying this all from scratch, and it's going to cost more or less depending on how much you actually have on hand. For example, this streaming setup uses a video camera. It has a capture card, runs it into a computer. They have the audio mixer, and they can stream to Facebook or YouTube. I think realistically, you're looking at a price, around $1,200 to $1,500 for the equipment. If you would like to see an example of this setup, you can click on the link in the PowerPoint, which will bring you to the Union Church of Peconico Hills to see how that works for them. And they are streaming, not using OBS, the software, but they are using the streaming service Restream to broadcast to Facebook and YouTube. So you can check that out to get a feel for what their streaming setup is like. The other option is the Mevo, and this was a little harder to estimate cost-wise because it depends on how many cameras you have, but you could probably get away with, depending on equipment you already have in the church, you can look at $900 to $1,300. You're looking at buying the Mevo camera, an iPad to run it with. You can use Wi-Fi in this case. That's okay to use Wi-Fi if you have a good connection. And in this case, some of the things that affect the price is perhaps you don't need a USB audio mixer because you're perfectly satisfied with the audio the Mevo cameras provide. But there is a way in this setup that if you would like to hook up your in-house audio system to these cameras, you could as well. So an example of a simpler setup using the Mevo camera that you can check out is Pleasant Plains Presbyterian Church, and on the PowerPoint, if you just click that link, it'll bring you to their setup. Oh. This is sort of where my church falls in, the $1,900 to $2,500 range. This is a more complicated setup, but you can see on some of these bubbles, for example, like if you didn't want to worry about slides or a projector, you can cut that out. You don't need that. If it didn't fit for your system, you don't need to worry about that. Same thing with the software studio. If you didn't want to worry about that and you were focused mostly on streaming to Facebook or YouTube, in an easier way, you could cut this out and focus solely on the streaming service. That's what I sort of mean in terms of a take and use as well, is that these are just example layouts of sources or formats for technology and how you could set it up in your church. But all these are different avenues. I'm not saying you have to include these things in your setup by any means. And I do list my church as an example for this kind of setup. The last setup is really like the if money was no option type of setup. You're sort of looking at, I think you're probably looking at $2,500 or up. You're looking at having multiple cameras, sound system, all that kind of stuff. I think for most places, you do not need to worry about this kind of setup. But if you wanted to look at it, you could. But an example of a larger setup with multiple cameras and things like that, you could look at a place like Larchmont Avenue Church in Hudson River Presbytery that uses this kind of multi-camera setup as well. So those are really the key points I wanted to touch on really quickly. And I do have some slides about volunteers that I feel like you can read, because I would really love to open it to questions, I think, if that's okay, Gene.